Hello, my name is Rick Chess, and I am a proud member of the board of Black Mountain College and Museum, Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center, excuse me, and also a recently retired member of the faculty of UNC Asheville. And I'm delighted to be here for our conversation with an extraordinary writer, teacher, human being, and a good friend of mine, Rodger Kamenetz. Hosted by Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center, these faith and arts conversations and interviews with a diverse group of artists, curators, faith leaders, and scholars explore the role of arts in spiritual practice and religious life in the arts. And if you haven't had an opportunity to explore some of our previous conversations, I strongly encourage you to go to the Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center website, where you can find an archive of all the previous conversations, as well as an archive of materials from our Faith and Arts Institute, which took place in Asheville in October of 2021, and other related material. Today, as I said, we are super lucky to have with us Rodger Kamenetz. Rodger Kamenetz is an award-winning poet, author, and teacher. Of his 13 books, his best known is The Jew and the Lotus, the story of rabbis making a holy pilgrimage through India to meet with the Dalai Lama. His account of their historic dialogue became an international bestseller, prompting a reevaluation of Judaism in the light of Buddhist thought. Now in its 37th printing overall, maybe it's up to 38 or 39 since the time this was written, The Jew and the Lotus is a staple of college religion courses. I can say, while I haven't taught religion courses per se, I've used The Jew and the Lotus many times in creative writing classes, spiritual autobiography classes, and other classes. And the students love it. I love it. It's an inexhaustible source of inspiration and information and wisdom. The New York Times called it a revered text. A PBS documentary followed, and a sequel, Stalking Elijah, was awarded the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish Thought. Kamenetz's many books of poetry include the most recently published, The Missing Jew, poems 1976 to 2022, The Lowercase Jew, Yonder, and Dream Logic. He has been called, quote, the most formidable of the Jewish American poets. His memoir, Terra Infirma, was described as one of the most beautiful books ever written about a mother and a son. When another of his books, The History of Last Night's Dream, appeared in 2007, Oprah Winfrey interviewed him on her Soul series program, saying, "What's so exciting about this book is that it talks about how there's a whole other life that we are living when we sleep, and that our dreams are there as offerings and gifts to us if only we recognize what the dreams are there to teach us." And I would say that Rodger also is here as an offering and a gift to us. And today we have the opportunity to recognize and receive many things that Rodger Kamenetz has to teach us. So I want to say one last thing about his most recently published book, The Missing Jew, poems 1976 to 2002. This is the most recent iteration of a 40-year project. And recently, I had the opportunity to make note of two kind of lifelong poetic projects in the American tradition. One is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. The other is The Missing Jew by Rodger Kamenetz. And so we are super lucky to have Rodger with us here today in conversation. So Rodger, welcome.
Thank you, Rick.
So we're going to talk about intersections between faith, spirituality, and the arts. In a recent email message from you, you wrote, "At this point, the distinction between poetry, prose, and soul are blurry, if not non-existent. And
Mhm.
so I love that, when I read that. And
Right.
that's something that I'm going to invite us to talk about a little bit. But this implies that there was an earlier point where perhaps there was some distinction for you
Mhm.
between poetry, prose, and soul, whatever soul happens to be. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit if, in fact, that distinction did exist. Maybe it never existed, but you didn't realize that it never existed. But if it existed, or what your understanding was of the soul or soul and poetry and prose, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And then maybe
Mhm.
we can move from there to like what transpired that has resulted in you now like understanding or experiencing the absence of distinctions between poetry, prose, and soul.
Mhm. Thank you, Rick, for that introduction. I just didn't get a chance to thank you enough. You said I'd be an offering, and I hope not a burnt offering, but maybe a meal offering. Yeah. So the question about distinctions, it really, I just spent an hour with you online without your knowing it because I listened to your interview and you read a poem called Two and One, and so beautiful and so much in sync with or communion with me. I just wanted to touch on that because this whole idea of the different and the same or the two and the one, really is so big in what we wrestle with from our background or our deep roots in Jewish text and thought, where on the one hand, there's a world in all of its multiplicity and especially all of its division, male and female, black and white, right and wrong, good and evil, me and you. And at the same time, we're constantly affirming it's all one. And so, how do we even say that? I mean, even saying God is one kind of makes a two out of it. I remember one time I was giving a talk early on when I had to join the Lotus, and um, it- I would attract a lot of Jewish Buddhists, Jubus, and a woman stood up and said, "I like Buddhism because it's non-dualistic." And I said, "I see, you're non-dualistic, and I'm not." So it's really hard to get away from dualisms of various kinds. And I think, Art Green, when I interviewed him in Stalking Elijah, was talking about the drama of distinctions. Kosher and treif is a big one in the Jewish sensibility. I interviewed a guy once, and Jewish and non-Jewish, that's another huge one, right? I interviewed a guy who said he was involved with Thich Nhat Hanh, Jewish guy, and he said he was learning about meditation, and he was walking in the forest, and he said, "Oh, that's a Jewish tree. That's a Gentile tree." It's so inherent. Actually, last night we had a reading, and last night we went to this dive, and they served tater tots and French fries. Now I'm going to ask you, Rick, which one is Jewish, French fries or tater tots? And which is
Hmm.
Goyish? And which is Goyisha? You know the answer. Come on now.
Oh no, I'm gonna get it wrong. You're putting me on the spot. Well,
No, you're not. No, you're not.
okay.
Tater
So
tots or French fries?
yeah, I would say tater tots is Jewish. I got
Oy
it
vey,
wrong.
no, 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 no.
No.
Tater tots is so Goyish.
Oh, okay. So then I need to know more about what's Goyish about the tater tots.
Oh, I can't go. I don't know. That's an intuitive thing. So maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
Maybe from where you're sitting, that's the way it is. I don't know. I
Well,
anyway. So it's a long-winded thing to say that I always felt this tension in my poetry. I was really influenced early on by Charles Resnikoff and the Objectivists, and they were really writing this, Charles Resnikoff's aesthetic was really this sort of plain spoken way of writing. And in fact, one time he wrote a book in poetry and then the same book in prose. And they said, why do you call this poetry? He said, because that was my intention. And I don't know if that's a good answer, but that prosiness embedded in poetry in my earlier work speaks to it. The division of my writing practice between writing prose books, starting with Terra Firma, and my poetry practice, my sense of confusion about that. And at the same time realizing that there's a lot of poetry and really good prose, and there's a lot of prose and really good poetry. Nowadays, a lot of my poems are prose poems. And I think they're more poetic than poems written in strict verse and meter. Sometimes when I listen to metered verse with rhymes that I can also write, it sounds more like prose. When I listen to prose poetry, it sounds more like poetry. So these distinctions are not so helpful, but they fill creative writing classrooms. They like say, oh, I'm the prose teacher, I'm the, whatever. And I think that's a problem for some other people. It's not a problem for me. But the deeper point, soul, that you're touching on is really something I've learned so much from what I would call the inherent moments of poetry and dreams, where certain figures who appear as beloveds, as mentors, as teachers, will speak in these compressed and terse ways that are not so easy to understand right away. They speak in a kind of pure poetry. And it's often the part of the dream that people want to forget or are most troubled by because it doesn't succumb to any linear thought process. It's actually the poetry in the dream, So what was it? The other day, someone told me a dream, and I'm sorry, I can't remember right now, but it was so interesting. I should be able to reel off 5 examples right now, and I can't think of a thing. Well, I'll tell you one dream. I saw someone who was dear to me, who's died, and this dream came shortly after she died, and I saw her in a blue yoga outfit doing this pose, and in my mind, I somehow thought that this was a film or something, and I wasn't quite as aware of my being in the same space. Or it's like there was no actual indication that I wasn't in the space, but it was in my mind. And this thought came that I was going to give her some advice about a book she was writing. And just at that moment, a woman called her Siddhartha. Wow. And I got it immediately. It was like, wow. So that kind of terse intervention of one word in this case, but it's so full, it can be explicated, it can be unfolded. It's full of implication. Oh, now that she's died, she doesn't need advice from me. She's on her journey. She's Siddhartha, the prince, on her way to enlightenment. And who am I, and what am I doing here? And so that's an example, maybe not the best, but it's a good example, at least, of the way that language appears in dreams oftentimes, not the language that comes from our heads when we're reacting, but the language often from others that I would say is the voice of the soul. I would say that the voice of dreams in this pure sense is the core of poetry. It is the atomic structure of poetry, you might say, the initial burst of it. So that also, how can you, at that moment, is it prose? Is it a prose poem? Is it poetry? Is it, what is it? It's what I think you and I know, because we're both poets, we both practice, it's this thing just before naming, this impulse we feel. And it's not quite physical. It could have a physical manifestation, but it's an urgency. And when you know it's happening, you try to get to the writing. It comes up as words and images. And at that point, it's all one. There's no sense of, is it soul? Is it poetry? It's just all. It's also, is it imagery? Is it language? Well, it's both. And I think that's really the unity. I mean, there is this unity we can experience. In your poem, you ponder this, like, how is it that when I'm walking by the way, when I lie down, God is one, but when I'm in the world, everything is two. And then you made a two out of that, like the difference between the public and the private, the relational and the internal. So I urge people to read the poem, but it really speaks to this question you're asking. And I think all of us are looking for a way to unify our experience. And I think that's actually it's wrong to say the goal of imagination. It is the product of imagination. It is what imagination does. It unifies experience. Aristotle says somewhere that history aggregates, poetry unifies. So we're all caught in our minds between these two, between history, which is just this thing and this thing and this thing, and poetry, which brings it all together as one, at least for a moment.
Wow. Wow. This is profound. Thank you so much. Is writing for you now a matter of waiting for the pure poetry of dreams to speak to you, and then when you wake up, you record that?
No.
Yeah. So there's another question
Go
behind
ahead.
that,
I'm
and that is,
sorry. Yeah.
is there something about the process of writing, the act of writing, that creates conditions in which you can get beyond what I'm going to call now the impure poetry, the impure language, to the pure poetry? Even when you use that phrase pure poetry in the dream or whatever, immediately it put me into this dualistic frame of thinking, like, okay, well, if there's pure poetry, there must be impure poetry. Was Reznikov an impure poet because he wrote in demotic everyday rhythms and speech patterns and diction? I don't think so. But and anyway, and I'm just wondering, like, what are the conditions in which we can access this or open ourselves up to it so it can offer itself to us in our waking lives?
Well, I think there is a state of consciousness where images move readily in us, and we associate it with dreaming, of course. That's for most of us, you might say, an everyday experience, whether we know it or not. There's reverie, which is waking or semi-waking flow of imagery in us that we also experience spontaneously at times when we're falling asleep at the wheel, or we're nodding over a book, or, of course, famously, Coleridge nodding over this history book about Kublai Khan and having his dream, which turns into a poem. I mean, we do all have this experience. So there's that. I find that writing a poem about a dream is dualistic. I had the experience of the dream. So when I'm writing about it, I'm simply documenting an essentially private experience, because the difference between a dream and a poem is that many of the experiences are so personal. There's so much involved in a private inner language of experience and memory and so forth. That doesn't mean there aren't good poems about dreams, but I'm just saying that that's the case. But what about what the Tibetans call dream mind? Because they talk about body, sense, mind. I'm channeling one of my Tibetan, body, sense, mind. Okay, so there's body, sense, mind, which is us right now. Like in your body, you're feeling the feelings in your body, and you're alert and attuned if you're awake. But there's also dream mind, and we experience that, and we can experience it at all times. Blake says, I view I'm not quoting directly, of course, but it's something like, I view the visual world as a hindrance to imagination. It's good when you meet someone, close your eyes for a moment and see if an image comes up. See if you get a feel for the person. It may be difficult to see those images when we're awake. People, when I ask them to visualize, they complain they can't see. But I learned a long time ago, if you think you saw it, you saw it. But it's fleeting, it's different. But in dreams, for sure, we see. It's not a question of pure and impure, because it's so much as this is an ongoing experience of what Coleridge calls primary imagination, which is somewhat passive. These images are arising spontaneously in each of us, right? All the time. That's why when people say, I'm not creative, or I wish I could be creative, I said, you were created creative. Maybe you forgot. Maybe if you don't go to the source, if you don't spend some time trying to give value to your inner imagery and your inner poetry, then yeah, it gets fainter, it gets less important. And of course, all the hindrances Blake talks about are amplified by, now, not only is it the natural world, which on the one hand we're destroying, so our contact with the natural world is more and more constricted, or more and more terrifying, hurricane, flood, wildfire, destruction. And at the same time, we live in this mediated world, and that one is designed to make money, talking about Facebook and Twitter and all that, or the news, all of it. It's all designed for the anti-poetic state of mind, which is anger. Our tradition talks about this, right? They say the Holy Spirit, doesn't rest on a person who is angry. So you can't be inspired. They even say, I think it's somewhere, I don't know, Midrash or Gemara, I don't know where it is, but they say that Jeremiah must have written the lamentations for the destruction of Jerusalem ahead of time, because having suffered it, he'd be so angry and so sad. The Holy Spirit couldn't rest on him to make the poetry happen. And one of the most horrifying passages in Torah, where Moses gives these sort of genocidal instructions about the Moabites, kill the women and children. Horrifying. It said, he just learned that he wouldn't be able to go into the promised land, and he was angry. So the Holy Spirit couldn't rest on him and give him and when you're angry, you lose your wisdom. When you're angry, you lose your poetry. So I guess I'm railing away, but I'm just saying that in our current context, listening to this inner voice, this inner fountain of images that each of us has, and valuing it, saying, this is important. This is what I think I'm going to pay attention to, as you have done in your life. I know you. So this is what you've done, right? If I could summarize your whole life for you, but that's my sense of you, that
Thank
you
you.
keep turning in to pay attention to what is quiet. And it becomes a habit, and a good one, and there are different practices for doing that. But everything in the world is calling us away from it all the time. So I can't even remember what the question was, but anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, this is profound. First of all, I've never heard that teaching about anger. The
Oh,
Holy
okay.
Spirit cannot rest on one who's angry. And
Right.
then to connect it to Jeremiah and that teaching about maybe having had to write Echa Lamentations in advance. Whoa, I
Right.
love that.
Right.
And connecting it to the passage about Moses and the Moabites.
Yeah, well, that's not me. I think it's Reish Lakish who teaches that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, but
Yeah.
that's what we do. I mean, we pass on the teachings that we receive, from others.
Yeah.
And to go back to one other little thing that there was nothing little in what you said, but your response to someone who says to you they're not creative.
Right.
And I love to hear that response, and immediately made me think of, well, yeah, if you just pay attention to what your mind is creating all the time. I mean, you may not be, whatever you think of as you
Right.
may not be creating it. But if
Right.
you slow down enough and direct your attention within, your mind is creating images, sounds,
Yeah.
language. It's just
Right.
producing this all the time.
Right.
And you never really thought about that as an indication of like our genetic and neurological design to be creating all day
Right.
long,
Right.
every day.
Right. Well, you're using, we have to be, think about this. First of all, the word mind can mean so many different things. Like in a Buddhist context, it's really almost mind heart. I mean, it's
Yeah.
different. And the mind can align itself with the body and the heart and the spirit. And when it does all that, we become an instrument, and then soul can speak through us. Through the body, we dance our lives, we touch. Through our heart, we feel connected to others. And through mind, mind opens up to the possibility of unity, of not of difference. So there's mind can also be great for distinguishing and for difference, but imagination, I speak of imagination and soul almost interchangeably. And imagination is this ongoing process. And Coleridge's definition of it is interesting, because he talks about primary imagination as a repetition of the creative force, or something like that, of the eternal I am, of the divine. In other words, our own creativity. The Hasidim say the same thing, that every thought, every feeling, every impulse is actually another manifestation of God. And that's why we could value it. But what kind of thoughts, feelings are manifestations, and how do we purify our hearts to serve you in truth? How do we listen more for what is that still small voice, and not the mind and our old conditioning getting in there and kind of taking over. So that's part of this process, right? That I know you know this, and I'm sure some of the people here know who have a poetry practice, or it could be any practice, but a poetry practice that you know when it's coming through you, right? You recognize it, and there's a strange quality to it. It's yours, but it's not yours, right? That's when you know. When it's just you talking or doing the rhetoric or whatever you're doing, it doesn't have that same feel.
Indeed. So can I ask a question that might be more mundane? I'm not sure.
By all means, we're being very lofty here, so let's go mundane.
Yeah. Well, I'm
I'm
not
with
sure
you.
that this is okay. I'm not sure this is mundane or not. And it's going back to the period of the Jew and the Lotus, and going back to the trip you took in 1990
Yeah.
with a group of American rabbis to meet with the Dalai Lama. And for anyone who's listening to this who hasn't read The Jew and the Lotus, it's a must read, as many others have said. But so, in that book, you write in part about the impact of that trip, the encounter with the Dalai Lama and Buddhists on your own spiritual life or whatever, and also the impact of your encounter with Reb Zalman and with other rabbis, who went on that trip. A question I have, though, is about whether or not that trip had any impact on your writing and on the way you wrote, how you understood writing, how you engaged in the practice of writing.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, the book is not only important for the ideas and experiences, but it's important because it's so powerfully and beautifully written with a sense of humor and humility, and wonder and surprise and dismay and all those things. But anyway, so the question is about the impact that encounter with the Dalai Lama and with the full spectrum of American Judaism or whatever, what impact that had on your writing.
I started in poetry. I'd written one book of prose, Terra Infirma, which came out with small university press, Arkansas. And so it was an exercise in autobiography, premature autobiography, I guess I'd say. And we'd had an experience. I had a son who died in 1985, and I tried to write about that, and that project failed. I had this huge ambition to be published and known, and all. That was a really big part of my affliction at that time. Yeah. And I think I was so overwhelmed by first encounter with the Dalai Lama and with the qualities of his listening, the quality. I never thought of listening as powerful. As an ego, I thought of speaking as powerful. But he made listening powerful. And then to see, to become a student of Reb Zalman's, to be with a master who looked into your soul the way the rabbis used to look and understand what you needed in what moment. It made it possible to see a light there. I knew something amazing had happened in the encounter. And I felt if I just could convey 1/10 or 1/100th of that experience to others, they would see the same thing.
Mm.
I knew that really deep inside, and I'd never had that feeling before about anything I was writing. I was writing to get published. I was writing, to get known or whatever it was. But no, all of that was less important than this sense of this experience that of such a beautiful exchange, especially between Reb Zalman and His Holiness. Especially the moment when Reb Zalman spoke about angels and said, if you do the dialogue right, the angel of Tibet is listening through you, and the angel of the Jews is speaking through me, and vice versa. That was such amazing. And it wasn't a metaphor to me in that moment. It was a metonymy.
Mm.
It was real. I was
Mm.
utterly convinced it was real, but not in the sense that I believed in angels, but I believed that language was the most concise, poetic, and true language for what was happening.
Mm.
So with all of that, and then having the opportunity to spend a couple of years writing the book, 3 years, immersed in every word and every moment. I had transcripts, I had film, I had interviews, I had so many different resources to go over. Again, just to be in the presence of these people, it had an effect. And to the point where, having written an autobiography, I tried not to even say anything about what I thought. And
Mm.
it was my editor, Amy Hertz, who said, well, I think you need to tell people your response. So
Mm.
I said, well, how do I do that? I've written the book. She says, well, here, 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 here. And she gave me a list of pages, and I wrote a few sentences, and suddenly I was in the book. So it was really kind of amazing. But it was the afterthought. It wasn't
Mm.
I did not think of all the people in that book that I had anything of great value compared to all these learned people and deep, deep people. So there was a kind of different approach. And I think it also enabled me, maybe you'll understand this, that when you write nonfiction, there's a fictional element.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest fiction is the I,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a creation. Whether you know it or not, you're creating an I that's either similar but slightly different from you. And in my case, I wanted that I to almost not exist, but I certainly wanted that I to be one who was in wonder and who was learning about these things for the first time, even if in some cases that wasn't really true. But it was true. It was true to the experience, but it wasn't true to the data. And this is like, so, I mean, the biggest fiction too, Rick, is the simplest thing is that you experience something moment by moment, aggregated, as Aristotle would say in history. But when you write it, you're looking back at it. And so you already know when you start where it's going.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, imagination can come in and shape it, because you're shaping, it's not the imagination of poetry, but it's the imagination of events, because there's a subtle imagination, right? Of, well, this is important and that isn't, this fits and that doesn't. Maybe this event that happened on Tuesday, I'm going to tell it earlier, so forth. So there's a lot of that going on, all trying to be true to the purpose of conveying the light. So that, I mean, I feel a little, maybe I went on too long for that, but just trying to explain.
No. That was very, very helpful. And I love, in this context, how you recalled that moment when Reb Zalman was teaching about the angels. I mean, it's powerful. Even if one of your hopes was to offer an experience to a reader that was somehow on the spectrum that included the intensity of your experience of actually being there, you certainly succeeded for me in that passage and in many others, as I know you did for many others. And excuse me,
Yeah, yeah,
I love that sense of moving away from writing with a certain kind of ambition in mind that is a result of American materialistic, capitalistic, ego-driven, individualistic culture,
right,
uh, toward a desire of trying to um, be a servant in your writing and be of service to
right,
others. And not even, I love the way you put it too, because you said, well, I didn't think I had much to say compared to the other people in the room who
right,
were the ones, leading this dialogue or whatever.
right.
And yet, part of the wisdom, for you at least, I guess, was seeing that and allowing this larger thing to speak through you, just like you talked about dreams or whatever, speaking
Right.
through you and to you. So I thought that was a beautiful answer. It doesn't quite, get to the point of saying anything about like, okay, did you write poetry differently, after that encounter? And there's and it also makes me, think about like in the act of poetry, it may not be a prior experience. Like you don't want to write about a dream, but you want to enter maybe the equivalent of or the waking version of a
Yeah,
dreamlike state where that language is coming. And so the
right,
process of writing, while we may not see all the steps that one takes, that you take to get there, but the
yeah,
process of writing is to bring yourself into that experience rather than to report out in a way that is not journalistic, but that is
mm,
creative, because the goal is to create experiences for others. And
mm,
I know maybe that's a goal for you as a poet as well. I suspect it is. That's what makes poetry powerful, is creating experiences. Um, but in the case of writing the poem, I'm imagining in some cases at least, you're the first one who gets to have, this brand new experience in the act of writing it. I don't know. I may be wandering a little bit
Well,
here.
I've tried. I would. Well, I've been writing. Poetry was the beginning. I started writing
Yeah.
poetry before I knew what a poem was.
Yeah.
I was 15, and
Yeah.
I've been writing it ever since. I'm 72. There was never a time when I wasn't writing poems. I had different relationships to that and different approaches. So, in looking um, through, I'll cite two different approaches that I've used at different times. So when I wrote the poems that are collected in the lowercase Jew, I had time. I was at the Vermont Studio Centers, and I had this idea that I would want to, again, thinking about that duality between prose and um, poetry. I wanted to write what I called a research poem, where I would actually
Mm,
gather a lot of material research and
mm,
write a poem. And I knew I wanted to write a poem about T.S. Eliot, and I wanted to write a poem about Allen Ginsberg and Ezra Pound, or two instances. And I also
mm,
wrote later around that time a poem about Mark Rothko. But in each case, I was in the library, I had books, I had material. For the Eliot poem, I had every single line in which he used Jew with a lowercase j. And I had them all there ready for action. And I wrote a poem called The Lowercase Jew, where he's put on trial by a rabbinic court, and his defense and prosecutors are both Jewish characters from Eliot. One is his defender is someone called Sir Ferdinand Klein. There's a line break there, which is an anti-Semitic line break, right? Jew-hating line
right.
break. Sir Ferdinand Klein, it's by the way, Ed Hirsch said to me, I was talking to him about this at the time the book came out. We both ended up in DC giving a reading, and his comment was, yeah, the anti-Semitic stuff was actually some of his best poetry in a certain way, which is ironic.
Mm,
But I understand that in a way, that his viscera were engaged with those kinds of lines. And um, so just being brief, so I wrote another piece called Allen Ginsberg Forgives Ezra Pound on Behalf of the Jews. And it likewise recounts an incident in which Allen in the 70s came to visit Ezra Pound and allegedly forgave him for his anti-Semitism. So, and I address Allen and I, address Ezra Pound and, so it's a whole thing. So that was a research poem, and some people call them verse essays. I don't really know. Everybody wants a little box.
Sure.
So that's a method. That's a way of writing. I'd like to go back to that. I'd like to go back to that. I have a lot of midrashic writing, I would call it, which I think is intrinsically Jewish, where you self-midrash, you take a poem you wrote, maybe there's a line that kind of irritates you, or like, I don't know about that, but instead of taking it out, start that as a title and make another poem in response to it. So instead of criticizing yourself, realize you have many voices in you, and then sort of play with that. And so I began doing that. I also wrote many poems in The Missing Jew that are responses to Jewish texts, where I get to hear those voices and do something in response. Now that's become a mode you and I both know, very familiar. I think intrinsically Jewish. I mean, other people can do it too, of course, but it's something we have as the interior structure of a Jewish poem. And then the third is what I would call, well, what happened was, Rick, I've been writing down my dreams since I started this work with people's dreams. And that's been since about 2003, where I started working with others. And I've been recording my dreams really since 99, pretty actively. So it's already 22 years. I have so many pages and so much material. But lately, I used to get up and go to my laptop because my handwriting is atrocious, and type them in and go back to sleep. But of course, more recent years, I have my handy iPhone, which we all have, we're all addicted to. And I use their notes feature. So I would wake up and write down the dream, little finger typing. But then I thought one night, because this would often be like 4 or 5 in the morning, I'd wake up from a dream, and then instead of writing the dream, I'd say, well, maybe I'll just write a poem. And I would just write, I would call it in the perfume of the dream. I would just sort of write in the wake of the dream with that same fluid feeling, movement. You're still in that state of mind for a bit. And so I took advantage of that. And a bunch of the poems, the newer poems in The Missing Jew are really, especially the prose poems, initiate from that experience. It's not the end of it, but it's the beginning. So those are 3 different approaches, I guess, that I've tried over the years.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much. And, I think it's time to maybe hear a poem. We're probably coming toward the end of our time for this conversation. And so I want to give you a chance to read a poem. And I also want to give you a chance, to bring up anything else you would like to talk about. And as you're searching for a poem, I do want to share with you, you said that Ed Hirsch told you that some of the anti-Semitic lines in T.S. Eliot's work are some of his best work. And Alan Shapiro one day told me exactly the opposite, that the anti-Semitic stuff in T.S. Eliot's work is the worst stuff because it's all cliches. So those are the places in which T.S. Eliot is not being original at all. So just interesting to hear 2 different Jewish poets responding to Eliot's anti-Semitism.
Well, I think they might agree if they were talking to each other, who knows, but not through me, and through you. But I would say that I think what Ed was getting at, and what I understand in making that poem, was the consistency of the imagery relating Jews to rats and raccoons and so forth was so visceral and so often repeated, that I would say each poet has this kind of system of word images, like word dash images that are inside us. We keep hitting them over, they keep showing up. And that was definitely true in Eliot's work, as I felt it. And so it's so visceral and deep and comes from
Yeah,
such a deeply unconscious place
right.
that I would tend to lean more towards Ed's view, even though it shocked me, since I was kind of thinking the way Alan did, but it kind of shocked me. But I
Yeah, yeah,
appreciated
yeah.
Ed doing that. So I'm going to read a poem from the lowercase Jew, even though I should be reading from the missing Jew, but it's okay. So because I like this poem, and um, it's an example of a drash poem in the sense of a simple case of a text, just reading a random text. Like, I used to have these volumes of the Talmud that a friend had given me, a dear friend, and I would just open it up and read stuff, and then certain words would stick with you. So this is called The Broken Tablets. Rabbi Joseph learned both the tablets and the fragments of the tablets were deposited in the ark. The broken tablets were also carried in an ark, insofar as they represented everything shattered, everything lost. They were the law of broken things, the leaf torn from the stem in a storm, a cheek touched in fondness once, but now the name forgotten. How they must have rumbled, clattered on the way, even carried so carefully through the wasteland. How they must have rattled around until the pieces broke into pieces, the edges softened, crumbling, dust collected at the bottom of the ark, ghosts of old letters, old laws. Insofar as a law broken is still remembered, these laws were obeyed. And insofar as memory preserves the pattern of broken things, these bits of stone were preserved through many journeys and ruined days, even, they say, into the promised land. So, so that one was a lucky day, or lucky several days.
Yeah,
Actually,
I love that.
I want to revise the poem now. I realize I should say the broken pieces were carried in the ark. Now I have to fix that. So
For the collected poems one day.
yeah.
I love that poem, and as you know, I happen to be leading a kind of class or whatever right now on your new book, and even though that poem and a number of the others in the lowercase Jew that I'd love for them to read are not included in the missing Jew for understandable reasons. You've now reminded me about that poem, and I'm going to bring it to the class the next time we meet, which will be
Great.
in another day or two.
Cool.
Is there anything else you'd like to, talk about in the last minute or two that we have here together?
I don't know. I feel like I talk too much, but it's lovely to talk to you. that's you're such a generous listener, and also enthusiastic provocateur of the best in all of us. So it's like you're really valuable. You're well deployed, as Reb Zolman would say. I think what you're doing. Maybe I could read another poem.
Yeah,
Is that
that'd be
cool?
great. That'd be
I wanted to read it
perfect.
because I read it last night and I had a lot of fun reading it, and so
Okay.
I'll read it again, and maybe I hope it's still fun. So I was reflecting last night. We were at this double book launch with Jay Michelson's book on uh, Jacob Frank, which I highly recommend. And I was with a wonderful singer named Basia Schechter also, and we were weaving together poetry, discourse, and music, and it's really kind of wonderful event. But I read this poem, and I said that I think two things that are really at the roots out of which I became so obsessed with Jewish, because I think like you, I wasn't really raised in an observant family or particularly religious family. There's no one like me in my family, has my interests. But and I think people get confused about that. You know, like what are these Jews? How come they're not Orthodox? I guess is sort of the,
Mhm.
or, you know, like people, even the word faith, no objection. I know the series is called Faith, but it always feels a little weird.
Yeah, I agree.
Although maybe I could use more, so maybe it's a good irritation. Anyway, you know what I mean. So I'm going to read this one, gefilte, if that's okay.
Please.
Colorless, odorless, tasteless, gefilte fish. Your hooves of brown jelly and ceremonial carrot tremble as if deciding between being and non-being. In the periodic table, you would be a xenon. I am here, says gefilte fish, and I'm not going anywhere. Take me as I am. Eat me to join a secret club. How I long for your unappetizing gray. Fumit goo melting around your waist, your jaunty orange cap sliding askew. A bold dab of horseradish gives you flavor you never earned. Boiled ball of fish flesh and matzah meal, bland, succouring the bland. The bubbling stew you emerged from was a witch's cauldron of fish heads, their dead eyes whirling wildly. You dripped like a Zoftig Venus. Or are you one of the castrated balls of time? Or the chilled brain of a zombie? My fork divides you, my mouth waters. I crave your permanent humility, your humble inadequacy. You accept you will never be beautiful, which is beautiful. Like me, you can only be yourself. Eating you is almost a cannibalism. How soft you are, like baby's food, mother pre-chewed. One taste, and I am me.
Hmm. I love that poem. Um,
Thanks.
so thank you, Roger. And I should have thanked you earlier for spending the time listening to my interview as part of this series. That was very generous of you to do that. But thank you for this incredible hour that we've spent together. I could go on listening to you and learning from you and being inspired by you all day and all night. And fortunately, I have your work so that when I can't be with you in person or virtually, I can always open a page and read a poem or a passage of prose. So thanks for being part of this series. Thanks for your friendship. Thanks for your work. We wish you well, and we look forward to being together with you in person in Asheville, North Carolina in the summer of 2023. So if you want more information on that, those of you who are listening to this, visit the Yetzirah Poets website, YETZIRAH poets.org, for information about a conference where Roger is going to be teaching and reading. And please, everybody, visit the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center website to view more of our conversations in the Faith and Art series. Thank you all for being here. Be well.